Welcome to this edition of the roughly weekly Committee on the Present Danger China webinars series, in which we focus on the U.S.-China relationship, the threat specifically that the Chinese Communist Party represents to the United States and, well, freedom-loving people more generally. We're going to have a rather special program today because we've done it on a rather urgent basis in light of what transpired in the course of last week in the summit meeting between President Trump and Chinese Communist Emperor Xi Jinping. We have some of the best of the minds of our committee and some of its key allies making presentations, and we're going to try to facilitate a bit of conversation between them as much as we can. We're going to hear first from Gordon G. Chang, eminent China hand. The President of the United States has expressed both admiration for him and a bit of upset because he speaks the truth to power, and we've asked him to do so in an abbreviated appearance. We will lose him shortly, but we're very, very pleased to have Gordon G. Chang, the author of a very timely book, Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Gordon, welcome. It's great to have you with us. Over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you so much, Frank. Most China-U.S. summits, they're canned. Everything decided beforehand. It's mostly ceremonial. They sign on a dotted line, which all the document has been done beforehand. This was not one of them. And although, we can say a lot about this summit, I didn't like it. I didn't think President Trump should go. But nonetheless, we should give a lot of credit to the president for trying to tackle critical issues on enemy territory. And that's exactly what he did. I don't think that we will know and can make really good judgments about the effects of this summit for weeks and maybe months afterwards. And I actually think that historians will debate this summit years and decades down the road. It was critical. We just don't know how. But we do know a couple things, Frank. And you called Xi Jinping an emperor, and he certainly acted like an emperor. On Thursday, in front of the cameras, in public, in front of President Trump, he made a couple references. One, Thucydides' trap, and the other, new era. Now, the Thucydides trap, that's from Graham Allison's book, and that refers to ancient Greece, where you have a declining hegemon acts dangerously towards a rising power. So what Xi Jinping was saying was that the United States was Sparta, the declining power, and that China was Athens. Actually, I don't think that that's right. Of the two countries, the United States is resurgent, and China is faltering right now. But that was with Xi Jinping. Now, President Trump was silent. He didn't respond. And I think that shows strength. The one thing that President Trump did was he took the Truth Social that evening and said that Xi Jinping was referring to Joe Biden. No, he wasn't. He was referring to the United States of America, to all of us, and to President Trump. As Jack Posobiec said, Mr. President, Joe Biden was not in the room at the time. And I think that that's the correct way to look at it. The new era language is more subtle, but I think was far more insulting because the Thucydides trap refers to a period of American decline, but new era talks about a period where China either dominates or rules the world, and the United States is nowhere to be seen. A lot of people have remarked, as I mentioned, that President Trump didn't say anything. I think that actually ultimately was a sign of confidence. Get to the next day, though. President Trump goes to Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound in the center of Beijing. And you see that the two chairs side by side, one for Xi, one for Trump. The one for Xi is much higher than the one for Trump. And that shows you the pettiness and the silly games that Xi Jinping was playing, because he obviously made Trump sit in an awkward position. And although I felt really awful about the first day with the comments that Xi Jinping made, I then thought on Friday that what we were looking at was a Xi Jinping who was deeply insecure, a Xi Jinping that had to show the Chinese people that he was in control, and he was going to go to any lengths, even absurd lengths like this, to do that. The issue of Taiwan came up, and again, we've heard some aggressive Chinese comments in public. President Trump didn't say anything about Taiwan when he was in Beijing, coming back on Air Force One. He did talk about it, and he made, in an interview with Bret Baier, he said he didn't want to see Taiwan go independent. That shows that Trump is using Xi Jinping's framing of the issue, and that was wrong, because as we all know, Taiwan is already independent. It's a sovereign state. It has all the attributes of sovereignty as are outlined in the Montevideo Convention of 1933. So I think that we see President Trump, who is sort of trying to be deferential to Xi Jinping, maybe just trying to stay out of his way. I don't know what it is. The big test, though, will be those two arms sales, the $11 billion one, which has already been authorized, but which has not, the goods have not been delivered. And of course, what everyone's focusing on, the $14 billion arms sale, which is about to be authorized or was about to be authorized. And we don't know what will happen to that. Trump on Air Force One said he will make the decision on that. And really, this is critical. Because if he doesn't go forward, it shows that Xi Jinping dominates President Trump. If, however, Trump goes forward with the $14 billion arms sale, he's saying to the Chinese, look, I am not afraid of you. And that's important because right now, I think Xi Jinping is extremely arrogant and is trying to intimidate. The Chinese narrative that started even while Trump was still on Chinese soil was that Xi Jinping cut Trump down to size. I don't think that that's the case, but that's the Communist Party narrative. And that narrative has been pursued. We see a lot of people in the United States adopting it. And I think that was this. As I mentioned, we need to wait to see what will happen in the weeks ahead. One other point on this, and that is yesterday, the White House issued its fact sheet on the results of the summit. And there's not much in there, but the important point here is that China did not issue a joint statement with the U.S. And we know that China has been much more ambiguous and not clear about what happened in their statement. This is a replay of what happened at the end of October when Trump and Xi met each other in Busan, South Korea, where the United States on November 1st issues a fact statement and the Chinese, they just remain silent. And there has been disagreement between the China and the United States about what was decided in South Korea. And I think we probably will see some disagreement from the Chinese with the fact sheet of November 1st. I think it's important in the future that when we have these summits, if we have these summits, that statements should be agreed by two parties so as to at least give some chance of good relations going forward. But I actually don't think China is capable of having and maintaining good relationships with the United States. I see China basically continuing some extremely dangerous activities. President Trump generously tried to give the Chinese an off-ramp, and I don't think Xi Jinping is going to take it. September 24th, that's the date for Xi Jinping's return visit to the United States, to the White House. I just think it's going to be hideous that we give him a state visit, considering everything. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope that Xi Jinping doesn't come to the United States, and I hope that we adopt a much more resolute tone, not only in private, because President Trump's been really good on China on a lot of things on the sidelines, but rhetorically, we need to have a stiffer tone from the president. Thanks very much.
Gordon, thank you. This was very, very helpful in framing a lot of issues that we will be discussing in the course of the program. Godspeed, my friend. We're going to hear next from Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired, Grant is, of course, well known to those of you who've been following these programs. He contributes to almost all of them, for which we are very grateful. He is forward deployed most of the time in East Asia, where he has worked as a businessman since leaving the Foreign Service in the Tokyo Embassy of the United States, and of course leaving the Marine Corps before that. He is the author of another extraordinarily important book, I believe a bestseller, entitled When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Colonel Newsham, it is extraordinarily important that you're with us. I know you will have to leave a little bit early, so we're anxious to have your thoughts and hopefully a little bit of interaction with you and the other team. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank. Glad to be here. In a couple of weeks, I don't think anybody's going to much remember this summit meeting between President Trump and Xi. There weren't any great successes or any great failures on either side that I could see. But the lasting, I think the biggest impression that I saw from it, and I really liked it actually, was that photograph of that dumpster bin with every gift that Chinese people gave the American delegation in front of Air Force One. They were all told to empty their pockets, empty their bags, and put it in the trash because it wasn't going on the plane. And that, I think, sent a very good message, very good tone for this, that we don't trust you. And that is a first if there's ever been one. So that was actually, I thought, a very positive thing. Now, a couple of the highlights as I saw it was Taiwan. You had Xi Jinping really lay into this. And he said, you know, if you don't give us what we want, we're gonna have war. He pretty much said that. And he was speaking, of course, directly to President Trump, but he said almost the same thing in November 2023 when he spoke with President Biden in San Francisco. Almost the exact language, you know, that, yeah, talk is good, but if we don't get what we want, there's going to be trouble. And America, the onus is on you to help us. So this is nothing new. And they do, as Secretary Rubio let on, but the Chinese do tell you what they're going to do. They telegraph their punches, and they need to be taken very seriously. In some of the language President Trump uses about Taiwan during the summit and after it on the flight back, etc., one wishes he would be a little more careful about it, because when he does sort of hint coyly that Taiwan could be a bargaining chip in some sort of negotiation, you know, he may not mean the full potential and sort of interpretation of that. And it does tend to get misread. But also there's people around Mr. Trump or in America's foreign policy universe who actually don't think Taiwan should be protected. The idea is that the Chinese military overmatch is so great that we would lose a fight and we would be so humiliated globally that we would be finished as a global power. Therefore, it's too bad, but Taiwan has to be let go. So I wish he would be more careful about that. In terms of using Taiwan as a bargaining chip, well, my goodness, that's been the US State Department's sort of standard position for decades. Maybe it's changed a little bit now that Secretary Rubio's in place, and also back when Secretary Pompeo was Secretary of State in the first Trump administration. But they have always regarded Taiwan as a dispensable irritant in a more important US-China relationship. So it's not just Mr. Trump who says these things, but in the case of the State Department, they actually meant it. Now, Iran, the Chinese, of course, promised, or they said that the Straits of Hormuz should be open and that Iran should not have nuclear weapons. Well, will they live up to that promise, if assuming it is one, or will they just have said it to have said it? Now, also, it doesn't seem as though President Trump made much of an issue of fentanyl. And this is a bellwether, really, when it comes in terms of how we're going to stand up to China. As we all know, they've killed over 800,000 Americans since 2013 or so, 800,000. And you go into a meeting with the Chinese and act as if you can have a normal relationship, which leads to another sort of maybe just the way President Trump does business. He tends to talk up his opponents, the people he's dealing with, even if they're nasty people. And he's been dealing with unsavory people probably most of his real estate career as well. But you sometimes wish he would lay off a bit of the, you know, you look marvelous sort of talk. You're a great leader, Xi Jinping, you know, this sort of thing. Once again, this is the guy who's killed 800,000 plus Americans. I think the number last year was only 40,000. So that's an improvement, I suppose. But he ought to go, if he is going to talk like this, he ought to go explain himself. Say to a group of the people whose children have died from fentanyl, and let them know what exactly he's doing. Now, when it comes to trade, he brought along 15 the prominent business people with him. But ultimately, I'm not sure that whatever deals are cut in these meetings actually matter. You could probably make the trade imbalance disappear, and China still sees us as an enemy to be destroyed. And agreeing to have the Chinese buy some more soybeans, which they sell back to us at value-added products at 4 or 5 times the amount, isn't a great success. Buying Boeing jets, that too, it's a temporary thing. As soon as China can make jets of its own, it will jettison Boeing. But the only thing that would really matter at any of these meetings when it comes to trade is if the Chinese said, look, we're going to keep all the promises we made when we joined World Trade Organization, and we're going to stop stealing your intellectual property. We're going to float our currency. We're going to make it freely convertible, see what happens, like we promised to do. We're going to stop trying to destroy every American and foreign company that comes into comes into China. And we're going to have property rights, and you can enforce a contract in China. Now, those would be some advances on the trade front. I would note that in about the 35 years I've been following it fairly closely, that every quarter, China has announced that it is opening up. And this is just the latest. So maybe one of these days they will actually mean it. Did Xi get the things he wanted at the meeting? I don't think so. He wanted free access into the US market, particularly so his EV and battery companies could get in and put US companies out of business. He wanted to have technology controls on exports, technology exports to China, have those relaxed. It's not clear that he got that. There is talk, of course, with the president of NVIDIA, getting onto the group of business titans and sticking around in China and moving around. It's not clear just where his sympathies really lie. He doesn't seem to know much about the nature of the Chinese regime. I assume he does, but I also assume he probably doesn't care. So that's something that we have to be very careful about. And really, the last thing I think that kind of cheered me up is we got a very good Secretary of Treasury. And at the end of it, he was talking about this new board of trade that's going to make it easier for Chinese exports into the US. And he said, well, yeah, it's going to be, for Chinese fireworks. They make them all. So we want fireworks. So he was putting the bar he was setting it very low, so that this is what we're going to be talking about. But for things that really matter to us, we're going to protect those. So overall, I wasn't disappointed in the meeting, though like Gordon, I don't think it should have happened. But we have to see. And once, as I said, call me in 2 weeks and see if anyone remembers this. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. We have a very interesting contrast there. Gordon Chang taking some of the same points you have on, but also saying that historians will be focused on this for many years to come, and maybe not weeks, Colonel Newsham. We'll see. Very much looking forward to figuring this out. I believe that we have a video from an interview that I conducted earlier today with David Wormser, that I think we might show at this point. Dr. David Wormser is one of our country's preeminent experts on the Middle East, but a very accomplished strategist on the world in general, having served in senior positions in the State Department, the National Security Council, and in the Office of the Vice President of the United States. He's also been a naval intelligence officer, rising through the ranks to that of a lieutenant commander. And we asked him in the course of our interview on Securing America to make a contribution to this program by addressing the treatment of Iran in the course of the Trump-Xi summit and where things seem likely to head from here, with respect to that issue in particular, but with respect to China as well. Let's go to the videotape with our friend Dr. David Wormser.
There's quite a few angles here. First of all, the superficial, which is there were some areas of convergence that really were already just embodiments of areas where the United States and China had some strategic alignment to begin with before the summit. For example, China wants the Straits of Hormuz open. 40% of its oil comes from Iran. It really wants to have them open and have access to that oil, which is also at a discounted rate. The second thing is China ostensibly agreed that Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon. That's a big statement at first until you sort of peel away some of the stuff around it. China has always said that. Of course, China then makes that contingent on a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region, which boils down to, first, Israel has to give up its ostensible nuclear program. So it's really not what it looks like. Same with the opening the straits. They're basically just, China wants its oil. On the other side, where there really was not, now the Chinese apparently, but only the United States has said this, not China, apparently agreed not to send weapons to Iran. Now, the question is what sort of weapons, because China may say, oh, we meant offensive weapons. The second thing is China sends precursors to weapons, or disassembled parts of weapons or major elements of weapon systems that technically aren't weapons. For example, the fuel for rockets or parts for their drones. These are things that are dual use or are not finished weapon programs. So China probably will still do that. The second thing is China has before said it's not sending weapons, and it did. The other thing is China has not committed to any reduction in their intelligence sharing and intelligence cooperation with Iran. And this is a big one because the Chinese were using their capabilities to essentially provide the eyes for the Iranian missile forces to strike our forces in the Gulf and in Israel. It's a very dangerous capability that the Iranians themselves could never provide. Those areas, there's still a lot of divergence. And this really boils down to the main question is, to really have a meeting of minds with China on Iran, you have to assume that there's some sort of an alignment of interests over China and Iran, and there isn't. Even on the very basic question of stability, China wants Iran to represent a threat to the United States in the region because it ties the United States down in the region. It bleeds the United States. It's an excellent mechanism to leverage to divide American political life between those who tend toward more isolationism and those who want a more robust foreign policy. So right off the bat, strategically, China has every interest in us having a headache with Iran. The second thing is there is a larger game afoot with China's penetration and its role in the Middle East, which is Turkey and Iran together represent the Western extensions of the Belt and Road Initiative. And part of that is the Iranian Cooperation Agreement from 2020, which involves turning over Iranian intelligence assets to China, which include all of Hezbollah's networks in Latin America, in Africa, which are extensive. And these are two areas the Chinese are trying to penetrate. So it was a very helpful thing. So there's a whole range of things that China has an interest in destabilizing the region and securing the stability of the Iranian regime and survival of the Iranian regime and empowerment of the Iranian regime. The final thing is the Straits of Hormuz themselves. It is a very dangerous precedent that we've just done to invite the Chinese in to help us negotiate a reopening of the Straits of Hormuz and by extension the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, because the Houthis answer to Iran and they control those straits. We are saying we alone will not be the guarantor of freedom of passage, navigation, sea lines of communication being free for international travel. We're essentially inviting the Chinese in to join us in having that global role of keeping sea lines of communication open. And that is a core mission of our Navy. It has always been something we have not asked other nations to do. And yes, if they want to join us, allies, yes, but any country that is inimical, we've never worked with. And the reason for it is we don't want to give them control over these sea lines of communication. We want them to be free and open in the seas. The Chinese would be working with the Iranians to ensure that, yes, there's passage, but there will be a regimen that is involved with navigating. We already saw that with the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. When the Houthis closed it off, the Chinese and the Houthis began to develop a ship registry that allowed ships to pass through safely through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits without being hit by the Houthis, which again are an Iranian ally. That ship registry, of course, the Chinese were involved with, which meant that if you were on China's bad side, whether you were Taiwan, whether you were Israel, whether you were a dissident who owned a shipping company, whether you're a shipping company that decided that they wanted to just, the chief of it, like Elon Musk with SpaceX, says something. This is what we have invited China into in Hormuz, and this is a very dangerous precedent. The Chinese have not said anything, so we don't know if they've really agreed. We do have the president thinking they agreed, but we've had incidents before where the Chinese promise and then don't deliver. They're not an honest government. The idea that they live up to their obligations and their commitments is simply not true. So we do definitely have a problem there. Second of all, it's quite possible that they have not agreed to it. The president didn't say they agreed to it. They simply said that they favor it. So I think that there's a very good chance that the Chinese are playing a much harder game. And by the way, this is, I think, overall the verdict of the summit, which is, in the end, I'm not sure on the Middle East that the president really got much out of the Chinese, because the president, I think, remained fairly clear-eyed on what it was that he needed, and the Chinese simply weren't willing to play. So to the president's credit, I think he held the line. But that also meant that I'm not sure on the Middle East much really significant was achieved. And ultimately that boils down to the key issue, which is China sees the survival of the Iranian regime as critical, because ultimately, if that regime falls, it creates a climate of freedom, apart from all the strategic questions. And freedom is infectious, and I think we really need to examine how solid China is if there's sort of a global wave of freedom from Venezuela to Cuba to Iran.
Thank you, Dr. Warnzer. Very important additional take on what is seemingly part of the agenda, part of the outcome of the meeting. Or is it? Well, we're going to continue drilling down on these questions with our next presenter. His name is Rod Martin. He is the chairman of the board of our Institute for the American Future. He is a successful serial entrepreneur starting back in the PayPal mafia days, and has continued to be, I think, an increasingly influential thought leader in the public policy arena, notably with a product he calls the Rod Martin Report. You can find it at rodmartin.org, and I commend it to you. Latest installment, I believe, on that page is one about this summit. And we'd hoped to have Rod here with us live, but apparently logistics for some travel that he's embarked on have precluded him from doing so. But he was kind enough to conduct an interview with me for Securing America on Real America's Voice, which will air tomorrow. Well, Wednesday, I guess, to be precise. But you're getting a sneak preview of it in this conversation that I had that we hope will be informing the remainder of this program with our preceding guest. Let's go to the video with Rod Martin. I wanted to start by asking you've set the predicate for this in an analysis you did in Rod Martin Reports about the summit being a good one for both Xi and Trump, and that one of the reasons that is so is because it produced some very important commitments, as you put it. Could you talk a little bit about those commitments and whether they're real?
Well, it's important to understand their summit commitments. I mean, you have a summit to agree to things in principle. You don't actually usually ink many deals that matter. And whether the Chinese will actually ink any of these deals remains to be seen, and whether they'll keep half of the ones that they sign remains to be seen. That's not really the point. The point is we establish the principle that they're going to buy a shocking number of commercial jets from the United States, which is pretty cool because the Chinese commercial jet industry has tanked. They weren't able to replace Boeing, as it turned out. They're going to buy a bunch of soybeans. They're going to do a bunch of good stuff. And maybe they do, maybe they don't. We didn't fight over rare earths. And I think all of that gets us to the real point, which is this is actually as most summits are, more about symbolism than anything else. The symbol here is that Xi Jinping gave Donald Trump tremendous respect, which might seem like nothing until you remember how they treated Obama when he went to Hangzhou, and they wouldn't even give him stairs for his airplane. He had to exit out the back. They didn't respect him. He acts like the busboy on the international stage, and that's how they treated him. With Trump, they treat him as a peer, which is a bigger deal than it sounds, because again, these are not people who think in terms of anyone in the world being their peer, even if they're weaker. And I think that's encouraging, and it speaks to the thesis I've been making for you for some time, and we'll get to that.
Well, I want to just, again, put the predicate that for those of us in the Committee on the Present Danger of China, which you are an important member, our premise is that we're at war with China. So whether this deference, this, red carpet treatment, and then some, imperial treatment, some have called it, bespeaks that of an adversary who is respected or part of a game is to be determined. But let's talk about Taiwan, Rod. There is concern that in response to a pretty direct threat from Xi, that the president didn't, deviate from, as Marco Rubio pointed, historic American positions on the subject. But that said, he did essentially say he was reconsidering or going to continue to consider in a manner that suggested maybe it's going to be reworked or canceled, perhaps, an arms deal to Taiwan. Talk about that and whether, if that were done, this might be a big win for Xi.
Well, it might be a win we want to give them for one reason or another, but I doubt we will. I mean, we had the same discussion about the arms deal in December, which, if you'll recall, was about $11 billion at the time. It was the largest ever arms deal between us and Taiwan. And it's basically all HIMARS and howitzers. I mean, and that's the thing. It's all about blowing up an amphibious invasion, ideally in the water, on the beach if you have to. And this arms deal is primarily about air defenses, which we're also deploying in Luzon, and we're also deploying in Japan, and the Japanese are deploying in Japan, and the Chinese are quite upset about it. And very little of that really got talked about. And then you've got the South Koreans, and then you've got the South Korean and the Australian nuclear submarine deals. And then you've got, I mentioned this forest of missiles that is growing in the Philippines. But the biggest single piece of the puzzle, of course, being the new defense pact with Indonesia, a pillar of the non-aligned movement all these many decades. And of course, the Indians have been too, but the Indians were always pretty aligned with the Russians, if we were just honest about it. But all of a sudden, the Indians are capturing Shadow Fleet tankers carrying Russian oil 3 days after they sign a trade pact with us. And the Indonesians come on with a defense pact. So if you're Xi, you really have a problem, which gets me to my ultimate point. We have flipped the script. 2 years ago, Xi was on the brink of controlling the approaches to North America. He had both ends of the Panama Canal. They're developing a base in the south of Argentina that could potentially threaten the Cape. He's got Venezuela as his buddy. He's got Cuba growing as a base of intelligence operations. You could easily see a day under Kamala Harris when you've got Chinese naval presence in the Caribbean permanently based. And now it's the exact opposite. We've gone 180 degrees from that, and all of a sudden Xi is rolling out the red carpet. So I think they realize that they have had to double down on exports to the United States to float their increasingly troubled economy. They've only got a handful of years left before the demographic collapse really kicks in a big way. And they need trade. They really are not in a good position to fight. Doesn't mean they wouldn't fight, just means they're not in a good position to.
and need energy as well.
Yeah.
And that's another place where the script has
Which
been
we
flipped.
completely control.
Yeah. So, Rod, I just want to reserve the rest of our time, about 5 minutes, to talk through this so-called Thucydides trap. Part of your analysis at rodmartin.org is focused on the thesis as well as the relevance of it to this present moment with China. Walk us through that, if you would.
Well, Sam Faddis read the book and we disagree. So, you know, smart people can disagree on this, but most of the punditry clearly never picked up Graham Allison's book at all. And what I mean is, it doesn't say that the rising power always topples the established power. That's not what the book says at all. They examine 16 great power rivalries where there's an established power, or Allison did 16 cases where there's an established power and a rising power, and what happens between them. Well, the first thing that has to be said is it doesn't always lead to war. There are 4 of the 16 in which there wasn't a war. In the remaining 12, the established power wins 7-5. So if you're Xi Jinping talking about the Thucydides trap, which in 2015, he outright denied even exists. He just said this isn't really even a thing, you know, to an audience that included Henry Kissinger, by the way, you know, and now he's talking about it. And it seems to me, based on what I just described to you, how we have flipped the script from them in danger of controlling the approaches to North America to us completely locking down all the straits through which their trade has to pass. We have seen a situation where he actually probably wants to be one of the duos in the 4 that didn't go to war, not because he doesn't want to kill us, not because he doesn't want to do big bad stuff, but because the whole point here, if you're the decision maker, not if you're an analyst. If you're an analyst, you have to look at the worst case scenarios. If you're a decision maker, you have to decide, okay, what can I get away with and what can I survive? And if you're Xi Jinping right now, a war with the United States does not look really survivable. And you might have time for an election to intervene, and then you get Kamala Harris, and then everything falls into your lap like ripe fruit. So this is the Reagan strategy from the Cold War. This is outlast them and let them collapse from within by putting so much external pressure on them that they have to stay peaceful long enough. And I know that's what Trump is attempting to do. I thought the Beijing summit indicated that it's probably working.
I would argue, having been involved in it, that Reagan's strategy was to catalyze the takedown of the Soviet Union. It was not a long-term strategy. The sort of détente / containment / all of that preceded him was long-term, but he was a man determined to bring it down, and bring it down if he could on his watch. Again, our Committee on the Present Danger China, and I'm speaking kind of in lieu of those who will be participating live in the program, but wanted to give you a chance to respond to this argument that, is it our objective to bring about the liberation of the people of China? And if this summit has the effect of further legitimating the party and or giving it some basis upon which to buy time till Kamala or somebody else turns up, is that really what we want, sir?
I don't know that we have a good choice. There's not a revolutionary movement we can arm, and if we did, we might actually get into a nuclear war. So, and Reagan didn't really do that. We certainly had things going on inside the Soviet Union, but we mostly focused on the periphery, and that's exactly what Trump has done.
Yeah.
You know, we've taken out Iran as a meaningful player, no matter how that resolves. We've taken Venezuela off the board. We're about to basically colonize Cuba. They're in trouble.
They're in trouble. Well, there is a very important point on which to turn to our last presenter. His name is Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired. He distinguished himself in the course of 30-odd years of service in uniform as a naval intelligence officer, rising ultimately to the duty station of Chief of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Subsequent to leaving the service, he has remained very active, indeed, I think increasingly influential in the world of monitoring, commenting upon, and figuring out what is going on with the Chinese Communist Party. You have seen him frequently of late on our friend Steve Bannon's program, War Room. And we're delighted to have him with us to sort of be the cleanup batter for this conversation, and in particular to respond to some of the points Rod Martin and other presenters have made. Captain, it's great to have you aboard. Welcome, and the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Frank. It's great to be with you, and it's always a tough order to try to follow up on these great presentations that went on before. A lot of great points have been made. So what to say in terms of how to wrap this up? I try to ask myself, what would I have said if Joe Biden or Obama or a Harris presidency had gone to China and we'd seen the kind of statements to Xi made by a Democratic president? How would we have reacted? And I think it's fair to say that most of us, even President Trump, admitted that a lot of people don't like it, the things that he would say. And so I think Gordon mentioned that it was kind of, he'd prefer if the president had not gone to China. And I stand with Gordon on that. I think it would have been nice if we had not, but the reality is it's over and it's happened. So the question is what really went on? And I think Grant hit a key indicator, which was to watch every American diplomat and military member and the president and everybody in his entourage, before they got onto Air Force One, walk over to that trash can and dump their electronic equipment. And for anybody that's traveled or done activities in China, you know how important it is not to have any electronic equipment if you don't want to have the Chinese spying on you and knowing what's going on. So that was a signal that this administration understood the threat. And I think another indicator of the threat being understood by President Trump was the fact that Xi repeatedly brought up the issue of Taiwan. He brought it up in that opening speech when he mentioned the Thucydides trap. He also said that, Taiwan was a common denominator between U.S.-China relations, and that if it was handled correctly, our relationship would be great. But if it was handled poorly, there would be, confrontation and conflict. And he said, Xi warned that we should never mess it up. So, and then President Trump on his flight home in his interviews mentioned that Xi spoke to him extensively about Taiwan. But yet President Trump had the discipline, the knowledge, the understanding not to go there, not to talk about Taiwan publicly while he was in China. So there are no quotes in Chinese press about President Trump saying this or that about the one China policy, one China principle, nothing about Taiwan in any way, shape, or form. He subsequently have made some statements on Air Force One coming home, but the fact of the matter is he did not get down to Xi's core issue. The core issue that Xi said was the most important for him, because it's the most important for Xi and the Chinese Communist Party's regime legitimacy within the Chinese countries and the people. Economic stability, economic growth, and this idea that the Chinese Communist Party would restore all of China's historical claimed territories, Taiwan being number one amongst them. And so President Trump didn't go there. The Chinese have very many tricks and sophistries to try to get the United States to play along. And I think Gordon correctly mentioned that President Trump disrupted their scheduling. He brought in all the leaders from our business community, our capitalists, the fruits of capitalism. Those 30 plus billionaires were brought in and out of schedule, brought in to be introduced to President Xi and the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's something that for anybody that's dealt with the Chinese, and I don't have near the experience that some have, but I have a few experiences in China at official functions, and the Chinese are emphatic about schedules have to be adhered to, and any changes will not be accepted. And President Trump blew that out of the water by introducing capitalism to the Communist Party. And I thought that was pretty important to signal that, as I think Rod said, the president was addressing and setting the agenda and showing that no matter what was said about the Thucydides trap, that President Trump was not accepting in any way, shape, or form this notion that America was in decline. It was just the opposite. And that President Trump was there to essentially say, hey, we have control of the Strait of Hormuz, which is 30–40% of your energy. And as David Wormser said, that's an important factor in terms of China's ability to function and to achieve their own stated goals. Now, what that means, after President Trump left, the next day in Chinese press, the Chinese Foreign Ministry came out and said President Xi agrees that the Strait of Hormuz should be open, and he believes that the mechanism to do that is a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. That's not fully giving President Trump what he wanted, but it is an acknowledgement that President Trump was able to get the Chinese to actually capitulate. They capitulated also on Secretary of State, National Security Advisor Marco Rubio. He had been sanctioned twice by the Chinese and over the years, and they looked the other way and allowed him to come in. So in terms of loss of face, China lost face in many different ways. Now, the press will say the opposite and that President Trump lost face. But as I said, I think President Trump demonstrated that he didn't compromise on Taiwan. He didn't compromise on tariffs. He didn't compromise on the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's bad behavior and that Iran wouldn't have no nuclear weapons. So the president was a diplomat. He was polite. He probably, as Grant indicated, maybe said more than some of us would have liked. As somebody who wrote a book with Brad Thayer, Dr. Brad Thayer, called Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, I'm always very concerned about the past 50 years of U.S. National engagement with the Chinese Communist Party, because what it does is it opens the door for the rest of the government to be pressurized into engaging with the Chinese Communist Party at various levels, whether it's the Treasury Department with this new Board of Investment, whether it's the the War Department now, formerly the Defense Department, the War Department. We just saw today in Chinese press, the Chinese have come out and said we're seeking now, because of this summit, to have increased mill-to-mill relations, military-to-military relations with the U.S. War Department. Interestingly, Secretary of War Hegseth was there. That was one of the first, or not a first, but the first time since 1972 that a U.S. president and his Secretary of Defense were there together in China. So I think it was another signal. Some would say it's some kind of weakness. I think the Chinese saw it as President Trump saying, I've got my defense minister here, my War Department minister, and he's just been successful in Venezuela and in Iran with this blockade. And if you guys, don't get the clue, this guy's now looking at you. And so I think we didn't have to say anything overtly. President Trump was very, very subtle and nuanced, but I think the message was sent. Last thing I'd like to say is the risk with engagement isn't just what happens with the rest of the U.S. government and all of our agencies and departments, but the Chinese will use what they call senior leader dialogue, senior leader summits to kind of write this permanent script for how things will go. And the Chinese have been saying that like they always do, but for the weeks before the summit, during the summit, and now after the summit, they're quoting these agreements. Now, as Rod pointed out, there really isn't many agreements there in terms of specificity, in terms of what was agreed to. I think that all the presenters have kind of pointed that out. But the Chinese made sure that they were pointing out that what they think is that there's and this is the phrase, and you've heard it probably on other shows, and it's from the Chinese verbatim, that they believe there's a new constructive China-U.S. relationship of strategic stability. Constructive strategic stability. And this is a riff off of the 2014 Xi-Obama summit in Sunnylands, California, where they promoted the Chinese Communist Party promoted this idea of a new type great power relationship. So the Chinese Communist Party is always trying to create a construct that will tie the president's hands in the future and tie the administration and American government policy that will be favorable to China. And so to that end, I think, as others have said, I think President Trump, while the Chinese may still publish that and write about it in their newspapers, President Trump doesn't feel compelled in any way, shape, or form to comport to any such constructive strategic stability dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean he wants to have war. The president said on the plane, I don't want to have a war 9,500 miles away. And a lot of people took that 9,500 miles away and as a, well, yeah, okay, he doesn't want to have a war across far from our shores. Well, what are we doing right now with Operation Epic Fury? That's about 9,000 miles away as well. So I think the president uses language in certain ways, in certain fashions, to make a point or to influence a certain adversary, but make no mistake, and he said it in Air Force One, if China were, or I think it was Brett Baer, if China were to invade or try to attack Taiwan, he said that wouldn't go well, and there would be a lot of problems for Xi if he did that. Well, that's a direct reference to U.S. intervention, and I think we all have agreed we'll have to wait and see what happens with these two arms sales packages, the one that's already been signed and the one that's going to be signed or will be, hopefully will be signed. We'll see what happens with that. But my assessment is at this point is that the president understands the importance of Taiwan. He has recommended they get chips out, but I think he understands the importance of it. And also the president, just like he said with Ukraine and in Gaza, he doesn't like to see people being killed. So President Trump's not going to sit by and allow Xi to feel that he can take Taiwan right now. And I think all of us have kind of assessed that right now it doesn't seem likely given where President Trump is in office. And President Trump said, well, I'm in office, it's not going to happen. So really the issue is, does this summit set the conditions for who follows after President Trump to ensure the peace and stability of that region and to make sure that China is deterred? And if they think they aren't deterred, that we can defeat them in any kind of conflict. And I think President Trump, again, the FY27 $1.5 trillion War Department budget is a signal of where the president's going. The Golden Fleet and other activities that we're doing to plus up our military strength in the region, along with diplomatic and economic strength in the region, and getting off a rare earth element dependency on China, pharmaceuticals, AI. The president seems to understand that he does not want to be subjugated to China in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's the subtle undertone of that summit, while the president was essentially doing what the Chinese have always done to us. Go play nice and see what you can get, what low-hanging fruit you can take from them, but not giving up the core. And so I'll leave it there.
Captain Fennell, thank you. Excellent sort of summation, as well as further illuminating some of the topics that we want to make sure we cover. I did want to ask you, and thank you also, by the way, for mentioning your book. I had forgotten to say that at the beginning. It is, I think, a critical piece of this equation, which I want to put to you rather directly. This idea of embracing communist China, specifically the Chinese Communist Party, exemplified really by the 30 plus billionaires that you mentioned a moment ago, who have all been described by the Chinese as old friends, I think, of China, or in their more candid moments as among the captured elite. But this is against the backdrop, Jim, as you understand better than just about anybody, that we are, in fact, at war with communist China, or more to the point, they are at war with us. And several of our presenters have spoken directly about this, but I do think it's critical to our ability to, think through both what we know happened, what we aren't sure yet has been the upshot of all of this, and what may well be forthcoming in terms of this relationship, not least the possibility that if what the Chinese have taken away from this meeting at the end of the day is that this is as good a time as they're going to have to go for it in Taiwan. Yeah, it's not ideal, and Donald Trump is a wild card, but that as I think Rod Martin put it, there's a demographic catastrophe hurtling their way. There are huge political problems. Many of them arising from economic problems inside China at the moment. And the totalitarians have a well-established practice, as you know, Jim, of when they get into this kind of difficulty, sometimes, conjuring up some foreign threat, some boogeyman that gets everybody to rally around the flag to protect the motherland in this case. So my question to you is this, sir. If China is at war with us, does what went down here in the course of this summit convey to them a sense that this is the moment to steal a march on Taiwan and to do so presumably precipitating a conflict with the United States in the process?
Frank, I think that Xi and company are, with Trump in power in the White House as our president, they are reluctant to make a move right now. They've been reluctant for years. They've tried to use non-kinetic means, economic coercion, diplomatic isolation of Taiwan, information warfare, and they prepared their PLA. But given the purges in the PLA and the disruptions in PLA leadership, they may be asking themselves, do we really want to go after this right now when the guy who's demonstrated he'll do anything, and we can't predict that, we can't be assured. I think that is going to be a deterrent to them. Now, President Trump's only going to be president until 2028. So we're talking a year and a half, 2 years at the most. And if somehow there is, as Rod said, a different kind of candidate, a Democrat president like Obama, like Biden, like a Harris would have been, that'll be a gift for them, and they'll be less inclined not to think that they can't make this. And so I think we're right in that position right now. But I also have written about this decade of concern, which is to say that the Chinese Communist Party and its leadership understand that they don't want to use military force, but at some point, if Taiwan doesn't come back, and if you have people like President Lai, who has just in the last 24 hours basically said, hey, President Trump was wrong on his flight over coming home from China. We're not causing this problem. China's causing it, and we're just here being independent. Now, he didn't say independent, but it was as Gordon said, by all definitions, Taiwan is a sovereign nation, even if we don't formally classify them that way in terms of the United Nations and all of that. I think the Chinese right now would be hard-pressed to say, I'm going to go, when I have somebody that's just demonstrated that they're willing to do Absolute Resolve, Operation Absolute Resolve, or Epic Fury. Different places, different concepts, but are they really willing to take the gamble, roll the dice, and be pushed off from their objective and be tangled up into a decade-long conflict or something worse over Taiwan? So I think for them, it's a matter of saying, let's keep sharpening our sword. Let's keep getting rid and purging generals and admirals that are not competent or corrupt and aren't in line with my thinking, Xi's thinking this. And let's prepare ourselves for the day when the U.S. is led by somebody who's going to be debatable. I think that's where we're at right now. The concern I have is we're still mired down in the Middle East. And I have, long argued that we need to get out of the Middle East. I think President Trump understands that and is trying to get us out. And so it's really a race of time right now to see who's going to get to their decision points to act. And I hope that we continue to fortify our presence in the Indo-Pacific. One of the things that reinforced to me that President Trump gets this over the last couple of months here is that he has not pulled the forward deployed naval force carrier, the USS George Washington, out of the Western Pacific to go join and shore up the carriers that have been operating in the Middle East. As long as we keep a strong posture there, it's going to be a deterrent to the Chinese. And so it's hard to say. You never know. Xi, though, has got some issues. It's a much greater distance than the invasion of Normandy. He's got 4 times the length to get over there, but he is preparing himself for it. They've got a doctrine for it. They've built a force structure for it, both military and civil, and we should not just assume that they won't do it. So we should be continually actively working and preparing for that worst case. Even though it may not happen, we need to be prepared for that and to use that as a deterrent.
Let me just pick up on that point, because I guess it's a central thesis of your book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, is that if what several of today's presenters have said, whether it's the lack of specificity in the agreements leading to the Chinese asserting that there's some sort of leadership direction that's been provided that they will, subsequently try to use to their advantage, Jim, or whether it's that we're simply going to be encouraged as a practical matter by the appearance that we have cordial relations with Xi Jinping into once again sort of letting down our guard, failing to take the sorts of steps that are needed for deterrence, and perhaps thereby creating, and I'm not saying that it needs necessarily to take the form of a violent invasion, but what you've basically described that's been going on now, and you didn't mention the Kuomintang, the opposition party in Taiwan that seems all too happy to surrender the place to the Chinese if they can. But that unrestricted warfare, the term we had popularized, I think, with these webinars, against us, may next take the form of a successful non-kinetic takedown of Taiwan, while we're signaling a kind of acquiescence to it, perhaps, if we do indeed see these arms sales canceled or delayed, or simply reconfigured in a way that is not going to be upsetting to the Chinese. Could you walk through how this kind of impact, the knock-on effects, if you will, of a summit in which Embracing China seems to have been resuscitated?
If we don't see arms sales, then it will be, as you described and others have stated, it will be a signal that Xi has achieved his goal, which is to stop the armament and defensive capabilities of Taiwan, thus making a blockade or an invasion much more achievable, and something that then in their decision cycle, decision-making process, scientific development, that they would be much more comfortable and willing to say, hey, this is now in our favor. Let's roll the dice. I think we can take this, or even greater confidence. So that's why the arms sales are really, really important. And so I'm hoping here in the days that come along, as President Trump said, he was going to talk to President Lai. He was going to hear from his advisors and his war team. He's going to hear from Congress and others. And I think the message will be to him very clear. Hey, you've got to continue to do this. You've got to continue to provide the kinds of weapons and munitions to Taiwan that aren't for, declarations of independence. They aren't for starting a war. They're just to prevent an invasion of their island. We don't even have to call it a country, if you will. So I think that's a message that the president probably already knew, but should hear it now from folks like us. We're not asking for war. We don't want, conflict. What we're trying to do is avoid conflict. And the best way to avoid that, as President Reagan said, is peace through strength. So we need to strengthen the correlation of forces between China and Taiwan that have dramatically shifted in the last 50 years, half a century. They've gone China one way, and Taiwan has stayed essentially the same in relative terms, and China's massively grown. So I think that's the real key, is seeing what happens with that arms sales package and making sure that we voice our concerns to the president in respectful and polite way so that he understands we're not trying to oppose him or anything like that, but we're trying to provide him our best advice. If that were not to happen and the arms sales were canceled, then we would have to be watching for dramatic actions from the Chinese. And it would be, something that could happen, very quickly, because it would be a demoralizing effect on the island in terms of their own defense. It may even embolden, as you mentioned, the KMT, the Kuomintang, to actually seek out some kind of political takeover in Taiwan and realignment with China right then and there. And for the United States, there's a lot of ramifications for that we've talked about on these webinars, not just with the chips, but with the geopolitical geomilitary positioning that Taiwan provides to China and what that does for the change in the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and the threats it makes to our national security. So it's really important that the president, consult with all of his advisors, but we should not be shy about recommending that we recommend that the Taiwan arms packages go through. And so that's the key for me, is that we have to continue to remind him how important those packages are for a host of reasons. And I think Taiwan, it puts a responsibility on the people of Taiwan to demonstrate that they're very intent upon defending themselves.
Yes.
And that's something that the president, I know, is very concerned about in terms of, why should I invest American blood if you're not going to invest your own blood to save your own territory and country?
Jim, I think that's an extraordinarily helpful sort of wrap on our conversation. I certainly want to very strongly endorse your assessment of the role that our Committee on the Present Danger China needs to play, which is not to be harshly critical of the president, but to be honest about potential missteps or the things that should not be done in the future, including failing to provide the kind of tangible support that the Taiwan Relations Act calls for one thing, but also I think could be incredibly detrimental to deterrence were we now to revise or jettison one or both of those packages. And Jim, I guess the other point that I would simply make is, while there's no disputing the analysis that our friend Rod Martin has provided about this so-called Thucydides trap, one of the things that has been a factor in this problem, as Steve Bannon has pointed out on many occasions with you and me and others, is that and I don't think any of those cases previously, certainly I think it was out of the 16 you talked about, 4 were negotiated, but 12 were fought. In those 7 cases where a fight actually did take place, I don't think it was ever the case that you had the leadership of the industrial base of one of the country that was the so-called declining power, working for the other team. And that is unfortunately a message that I fear, whether it was useful in upending the schedule and therefore giving a sort of tactical advantage to the president, or whether it was simply a hope to prime the pump for more deals. The cumulative effect, I fear, was to signal that we are good with people, prominent, very successful, very powerful business leaders, helping improve not just the balance sheet, but the military capabilities of this mortal enemy, the Chinese Communist Party. And I know you feel as strongly as I do, Jim, that has been America's greatest strategic failure to date. And if that were the takeaway, then I think that it makes more likely, considerably more likely, the further aggressive proclivities of the Chinese Communist Party to seize not just Taiwan, but to become the dominant power in the world, as we said at the very outset. And that would be at our expense, needless to say. We're going to leave it at that. Captain Jim Fennell, the last man standing, thank you for your great leadership in all of these issues, including as a member of our committee on the present danger of China. I want to thank all of our other presenters, Gordon Chang, David Wormser, Grant Newsham, Rod Martin. Thank you for all of you listening, if not at this moment, then in the future, in the hopes that you will assist us in amplifying these messages and making sure that we are not surrendering not just our own freedom and security, but that of the rest of the world as well, to that mortal enemy, the Chinese Communist Party. God bless you all. God bless America. And stay tuned for more weeks to come here at presentdangerchina.org.